This anime series begins by showing the great battle that took place on October 21, 1600, which brought together the Eastern Army, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, against the Western Army led by Ishida Mitsunari, which the battle would later be known as the Battle of Sekigahara in history. During the war, Masanori Fukushima, the commander of the Eastern Army, looks confused when he sees the soldiers' fighting spirit, which seems endless, even though the Eastern Army has managed to corner them in battle. Slowly but surely, the Western Army turned out to be able to turn things around, so Masanori and the soldiers from the Eastern Army immediately became overwhelmed in the face of the onslaught of attacks. On the other hand, Shimazu Toyohisa, the commander of the Western armies, had known that Naomasa and his army were heading toward them to fight. Because of that, Toyohisa asked his uncle, Shimazu Yoshihiro, to hurry away from the battlefield with his guards and let himself lead the Western army to face Naomasa and his army. Toyohisa made this decision not solely without reason, because he knew that the key to their victory was if Yoshihiro managed to return safely to Satsuma. Even though there was a debate between the two of them, Yoshihiro finally complied with his nephew's wishes because there really was no other choice. Shortly after Yoshihiro and his guards left the battlefield, the cavalry led by Naomasa approached so fast where Toyohisa and his troops were currently. The thick fog and rumbling sounds that sounded from a distance indicated that the number of these troops was far more than the Western army led by Toyohisa. However, Toyohisa didn't look the least bit daunted, and his expression looked calm and so confident about the upcoming battle as if he could confirm that victory was within his grasp. When Naomasa and his army were in sight, Toyohisa ordered his soldiers to fire at the enemy troops. However, the Western army immediately became desperate because, besides being outnumbered, Naomasa ordered his men to directly slaughter the Western army while they prepared their firearms for their next attack. On the other hand, Toyohisa's fighting spirit did not waver, and he stood firm against the enemy, even though his army had been defeated. By swinging his sword, he then rushed toward Naomasa. Seeing the enemy approaching their general, Naomasa's guards did not stay silent and rushed to protect him while trying to face Toyohisa, who was preparing to attack them. Thinking that Toyohisa would surrender because they were outnumbered, Naomasa and his army looked shocked when they saw him desperately breaking through their defenses regardless of the dozens of spears that stabbed into his body. Unexpectedly, Toyohisa turned out to have devised a strategy in such a way that he could approach the general of the Eastern Army and immediately fired a shot at Naomasa, which hit him in the chest. Seeing that their leader was badly injured by Toyohisa's gunfire, the Eastern Army decided to withdraw from the battlefield, leaving him, who could still stand upright despite being seriously injured. With severe injuries all over his body, Toyohisa tried to get up and return to Satsuma. Even though he couldn't reach his destination safely, he continued to swing his steps through the forest in the darkness. As he walks from the battlefield bleeding, Toyohisa finds himself transported to a corridor of doors, where a bespectacled man named Murasaki at a desk waits for him. Seeing his arrival, Murasaki folded the newspaper he was reading, took several sheets of paper bearing his name, and then wrote something on the paper. Because the bespectacled man in front of him didn't say anything, Toyohisa tried to attack him because he thought the man was his enemy. But then, Toyohisa was suddenly sucked into one of the doors and dropped into a field, unconscious. After that, two elven boys were seen approaching him. The two elven boys are Marcia and Mark, a pair of brothers who live in a village not far from the forest where he is currently located. They looked surprised to see him lying unconscious with wounds all over his body. However, after seeing Toyohisa's appearance, the siblings knew he was not from their world. Marcia and Mark then talk about drifters and assume that he is a drifter who came to their world. At the same time, Toyohisa finally came to his senses, but his body still felt so weak that he could not stand up. Because he seems to be badly injured, they decide to take him to a castle ruin, which is the hiding place of the drifters, as strangers like him come into their world. The two brothers looked overwhelmed to support Toyohisa's body, which was bigger than theirs. Even so, they continued to advance towards their destination to save him because his safety would be threatened if he was left alone in the forest. In fact, they were afraid of dealing with the drifters like Toyohisa. Apart from being strangers who are not from their world, Marcia and Mark are threatened with punishment from the Knights of the Orde Empire, who have ordered them to avoid direct contact with the drifters. Even so, they sympathize with him and decide to help him. Before reaching the castle ruins not far in front of them, Marcia and Mark suddenly stopped when a drifter ordered them not to go further. The drifter then readied his bow and was about to shoot the two brothers when they tried to explain that they only wanted to take a man who was injured. But the difference in language makes it difficult for them to understand each other, so almost a dispute arises. Realizing the sincerity of the two elven boys who only intended to help the man, the drifter finally lowered his weapon and told Marcia and Mark to leave the place immediately. After that, the archer drifter met his comrade who was in the castle ruins and told him about two nearby villagers who had delivered another drifter who had just arrived seriously injured. Knowing that Toyohisa was wearing clothes bearing the symbol of a clan originating from Japan, the drifter who was in the castle immediately ordered him to bring him in and treat his wounds. Long story short, after his wounds were treated, Toyohisa finally came to his senses and seemed very surprised by the situation around him. As a very experienced soldier on the battlefield, he reflexively drew his sword and tried to attack the man sitting in front of him, who had been watching him for a long time. Unexpectedly, the man could dodge his attack until finally, he stopped attacking when he finally found out that the man standing in front of him right now was Oda Nobunaga, a famous warlord. He conquered most of Japan during the Sengoku period. Even though Nobunaga told the truth, Toyohisa didn't believe his words at all because, according to his knowledge, Oda Nobunaga had long been dead. The three of them then engage in conversation as fellow drifters. Toyohisa finally realizes that there is a significant time difference between their world and the other world where they are currently. He revealed that Oda Nobunaga had been declared dead 18 years ago, while Nobunaga claimed that he had not even been in that place for a year. Hearing Nobunaga's confession, Toyohisa became even more curious about what really happened to them. After that, he asked about the archer drifter's identity, who introduced himself as Nasu Sukataka Yoichi. Although Yoichi looks very young because he is only 19 years old, in reality, he had lived hundreds of years before Nobunaga and Toyohisa because he turned out to be a powerful warrior involved in the Genpei War that took place in the 1180s. Toyohisa reveals his true identity as belonging to the Shimazu clan and talks about the bespectacled man he met in a long hallway before he was suddenly sucked into a door and ended up in the world they are currently in. Hearing this, Nobunaga and Yoichi also revealed that they had also experienced the same thing before coming to this world and then wondered about who the mysterious bespectacled man really was and his purpose in sending them to this world. Knowing that Toyohisa came from an era that was not much different from his time, Nobunaga then asked about his eldest son, Oda Nobutada. Toyohisa reluctantly explains that Nobutada was ultimately defeated by Akechi Mitsuhide. Nobunaga was silent when he heard the tragic fate of his beloved son. However, it was clear on his face that Nobunaga was trying to contain the anger and sadness in his heart. Meanwhile, outside the castle ruins, a woman named Almanu secretly spied on the three of them. She reported her observations to her leader, who was elsewhere via a crystal ball. Knowing about the emergence of a new drifter, the leader then asked Almanu to carry out their plan because the Black King had prepared his troops to wipe out all mankind from the face of this earth. Elsewhere, her comrade, a young man named Ham, appears to be keeping an eye on two other drifters embroiled in a bitter feud. Ham, who also received the same order from the leader, was finally forced to intervene to stop the dispute between the two drifters. Meanwhile, Marcia and Mark seemed to be severely scolded by their older brother, Shara, because they had helped the drifter, even though they already knew the heavy punishment they would receive if their actions were discovered by the Knights of the Orde Empire, who had made it forbidden for the residents to approach the drifters, which they considered a threat. Even though Marcia and Mark carried out the rescue action secretly, the Empire seemed to have found out about their actions and sent one of the knights named Aram to lead the troops and attack the village where they lived as punishment for both of them for violating the rules. At the same time, Toyohisa and the drifters immediately realized a war was happening in the elves' residential area. They suspected the masterminds behind the attack were bandits who wanted to control the village. Furthermore, Nobunaga said that the two brothers who had saved Toyohisa were the elves who came from a village not far from where they are now. Upon hearing that, Toyohisa rushed to the village where Marcia and Mark lived, ignoring the condition of his body which had not fully recovered after the Battle of Sekigahara. Toyohisa doesn't care about his health because he can't let injustice and oppression happen before his eyes whenever and wherever he is. Seeing Toyohisa, who was so confident and determined to uphold justice, Nobunaga and Yoichi became excited to follow him and fight with him in the war. Almanu, who saw their movement towards the battlefield, immediately reported this to their leader. On the way to the village, Toyohisa and the drifters met Marcia and Mark, who were trying to save themselves and tried to ask the drifters for help. Nobunaga immediately fired shots at the people chasing the two boys and Toyohisa, who swung his sword and slashed them all. Marcia and Mark looked very surprised because the man they had saved was surprisingly tough and could trounce the Imperial soldiers. After defeating several of them, Nobunaga finally learned that the people who had attacked the village were not bandits but the Imperial troops led by a knight. Instead of being afraid, Nobunaga was even more excited because he had not acted in a long time on the battlefield. Meanwhile, in the burnt and ravaged village, Aram gathers the villagers, who are elves. He says they all deserve the severest punishment for daring to violate the Empire's regulations, which strictly forbid the elves from getting involved with the drifters. The village leader then tried to explain to Aram that they were only trying to save the life of a dying man. The young elf man bravely asked Aram to stop treating his people arbitrarily. Their lives became very miserable after the greedy and arrogant nobles ran the government as they pleased. Aram didn't even hesitate to show that the elves were completely worthless in his eyes by killing the village leader right in front of them. The cruelty of Aram and his soldiers continued to slaughter the villagers indiscriminately, whether they were adults or children. Shortly after, a soldier approached Aram and frantically reported to him that all the wheat fields around the village had been devoured by fire. He rushed to the site of the fire and was very surprised to see the wheat fields that had been the gold mines of the nobles had turned into a sea of fire. He thought about trying to put out the fire along with his soldiers, but with the flames spreading throughout the area, then it was certain that they would not be able to extinguish it in a short time. The mastermind behind the fire is none other than Nobunaga, whose aim is to avenge Aram and the nobles, who often act arbitrarily against the elves and make it easier for them to take power from the greedy and arrogant nobles. At the same time, Aram and his warriors are shocked by the appearance of someone amid the flames, none other than Toyohisa, who is ready to slay them all with his sword. With his experience on the battlefield as well as his extremely formidable fighting ability, Toyohisa could easily slay the soldiers of the Empire. Aram found out that Toyohisa was a drifter because of his clothes and the language difference that made it difficult for them to communicate. Marcia and Mark decided to return to the village with Toyohisa and told their older brother that he had saved them both and would fight for the elves. After that, Aram and Toyohisa immediately engage in a fierce one-on-one duel, where he looks so angry that Aram and his army have massacred the weak and helpless villagers. Toyohisa then threw his sword at him and ran as fast as he could until he finally managed to knock Aram down. After that, Toyohisa locks Aram's movement beneath him and beats Aram heavily with his scabbard. The elves looked wide-eyed in shock when they saw that one of the most formidable knights in the Orde Empire could easily be defeated by a drifter who had just arrived in their world. While Toyohisa beats Aram to a pulp, Yoichi appears to shoot his arrows at the remaining soldiers trying to escape from there and kill them. After confirming that Aram would no longer be able to rise to fight, Toyohisa then asked the elves to take their revenge on him by killing him. At first, the elves refused Toyohisa's request because they feared it would cause even bigger problems. However, Toyohisa persisted in convincing the elves to avenge the deaths of the villagers who had been massacred by Aram and his army. Even though the elves didn't really understand his words, they finally realized that they had to have the courage to put up a fight to stop the nobles' oppression of the elves. Full of anger, the elves took the weapons lying near them and brutally killed Aram. The killing of Aram was also intended as a form of resistance to the cruelty of the nobles who always oppressed the elves. From now on, they will not stand by and will fight with all their might to protect what is important to them. Seeing the courage and determination possessed by the elves, Toyohisa was a little relieved because he could help them understand the importance of fighting for their own lives from oppression in any form. After that incident, the elves finally realized that the drifters had very great power, which also explains why Aram and the nobles forbade the elves to interact with the drifters, which could potentially be a difficult threat to deal with if they succeeded in leading the elves into resistance against the nobles as well as the empire. News of the success of Toyohisa and the drifters defeating Aram and his army was immediately known to Murasaki, who was in his place. Not long after, a woman named Easy appeared from the opposite direction, where her appearance then enveloped the place with an aura of darkness. Easy tells Murasaki that the drifters sent by him to this world will not be able to last much longer because the victory will be on her side. Murasaki didn't seem to pay much attention to Easy's words and insisted that he would not let her achieve her goal, then kicked her out of there. Easy, who heard his words, suddenly felt irritated, and with her power, she changed the news about Toyohisa's success with news about the Black King who had launched an attack in the south. After that, Easy emphasized to Murasaki that the drifters would not be able to defeat her subordinates, known as the Ends. Upon learning that, he does not deny that the Ends are a formidable opponent for the drifters because, like the drifters, the Ends are the powerful historical figures brought into this world. Meanwhile, Almanu, who turned out to be part of the Octobrist organization, a group of human magicians native to the world whose duty is to observe and gather the drifters together to fight the Black King, then reported about Toyohisa and the drifters. They managed to defeat Aram and his army and formed an alliance with the elves. Upon hearing that, the leader of the Octobrist, Seimei, rushed to meet Ham, who had succeeded in persuading two old men who were the drifters. They were Scipio Africanus and Hannibal Barca, who were involved in a fierce dispute before Ham finally reconciled the two and persuaded them to go with him. Knowing that the Black King had launched an attack on the southern region, Seimei and Ham rushed towards the Kingdom of Carneades, where they tried to convince the commander of defensive troops to let Scipio and Hannibal take charge of their army. However, the leaders refused to give the two drifters command over their troops, seeing them as nothing more than useless old men. Unable to reason with the Carneades soldiers, Seimei decides to withdraw the Octobrist and the drifters from the country because the Black King and his army will soon arrive at the Kingdom of Carneades. Knowing that they would have a hard time fighting the Black King without the help of the drifters, Seimei didn't want to risk forcing the Octobrist to keep fighting without a proper commando who could lead them in battle. However, before Seimei and the Octobrist had left the place, the Black King and his army had already arrived in the Kingdom of Carneades. Seeing the Black King's army, which was far more numerous than they expected, the commanders of Carneades' army immediately became frightened, especially when the Black King launched an attack on the defensive fort. To speed up the movement of his troops to occupy the fortress of the Kingdom of Carneades, the Black King then ordered the Ends, which consisted of Hijikata Toshizo, Jeanne d'Arc, and Anastasia Romanov, who were powerful historical figures whose combat abilities could not be underestimated. Apart from the three of them, the Black King also had an army of non-human races and a herd of dragons who launched attacks from the air. With such a formidable fighting power and almost no gaps to be defeated, the Black King and his army could easily master the battle, and it was only a matter of time before they would occupy the Kingdom of Carneades, which ruled the north. Suddenly, a connecting door between dimensions appeared during the ongoing war that hovered above the battlefield. Until then, the door opened and brought a fighter plane from the World War II era. Seimei, as well as the Ends, who witnessed the appearance of the fighter plane, immediately found out that the pilot driving the fighter was the drifter who was sent to this world. The pilot of the fighter plane was Naoshi Kano, who died in World War II in 1945. At first, he was confused by the circumstances around him and the fierce battle that was taking place below him. He flew his plane around the area to find out what really happened and where he was at this time. At the same time, Hijikata managed to break through the defenses of the Carneades soldiers who tried to block him, destroying one of the entrances in the fort. When Hijikata walked into the fortress, they could feel a huge killing aura from within him, which indicated that he was not an ordinary person because, with his aura alone, he could make others tremble and choose not to face him. Meanwhile, Jeanne d'Arc seemed dissatisfied with just slaughtering the Carneades soldiers because she used her ability to manipulate fire and then burn the soldiers. On the other hand, Anastasia, who always seems emotionless, has quite a terrible power because of her supernatural ability to create blizzards, where she does not hesitate to freeze the Carneades soldiers who try to attack her. Shortly afterward, the fort was finally fully controlled by the Black King and his army, where the Black King immediately ordered his army to massacre all soldiers, even the residents of the Kingdom of Carneades they encountered, whether women or children. Naoshi, who watched the massacre from a distance, does not just stand still and rush to help them. The scene then switches and shows two drifters looking anxiously awaiting the arrival of Seimei and the Octobrist, where previously they had planned to leave the Kingdom of Carneades as soon as possible. Not long after, Seimei and Ham finally came with Scipio and Hannibal and then asked the two drifters to quickly take them away from there in a horse-drawn carriage. Before leaving, Seimei asked the drifters to stay afloat no matter what because their next mission was to find Toyohisa and his comrades and convince them to work together against the Black King and his army. Because by gathering the drifters, they will have a commensurate strength to match the Ends under the orders of the Black King. On the way, several soldiers from the Black King's army confronted Seimei and the drifters. One of the drifters, a man nicknamed the Sundance Kid, then uses a Gatling gun to ward off attacks from the Black King's troops. After successfully defeating the Black King's army that was chasing them, Seimei and the drifters were surprised by the appearance of a dragon about to attack them. At the same time, Naoshi arrived and immediately attacked the dragon with consecutive shots fired from his fighter plane, indicating that Naoshi had sided with the drifters. After confirming that Seimei and the drifters had left the fort safely, Naoshi returned to the battlefield, tried to defeat the dragons attacking the fort from the air, and immediately attacked the dragon with consecutive shots fired from his fighter plane. Meanwhile, seeing the fortress belonging to the Kingdom of Carneades behind him that had been destroyed and controlled by the Black King, Seimei promised he would not let something similar happen anywhere else and was determined to defeat the Black King and his army in the upcoming battle. On the other hand, the Black King was not necessarily satisfied despite having won the battle and mastered the fort. He ordered the Ends to find the drifters and kill them and everyone who fought alongside them without exception. The news of the Black King's victory in battle and successfully occupying the fortress in the north then made Easy even more arrogant in front of Murasaki. Easy feels very confident that the drifters sent by Murasaki to this world will not be able to defeat the Ends and stop the Black King from realizing his desire to rule the world. However, Murasaki completely ignored her words, which he thought were too quick to assume, because the real battle had not yet started. Elsewhere, Almanu, who was assigned to spy on Toyohisa and his comrades, was finally caught and interrogated by them because they thought that she was a spy for the nobles. Almanu denied the accusations and revealed that she's part of the Octobrist organization, whose duty is to observe and gather the drifters like them. She informs the drifters that they have been brought to the New World to fight against the Ents and the Black King, who intend to destroy the world. Furthermore, Almanu explained that the Ents are actually powerful historical figures who were selected and sent to this world with a different purpose from the drifters. She says that the Octobrist organization's goal is to gather the drifters from all over the country and make sure they form an alliance to work together against the Black King and his army, including the Ents, who are his most powerful warriors. Upon learning that, Nobunaga then asked Almanu about the number of troops owned by the Octobrist and the Alliance troops. Since she could not answer the question in detail, Nobunaga then said that they would not be able to win the battle, even with the help of the drifters, because basically, the number of troops would more or less affect their strength on the battlefield. Almanu, who didn't want to lose Nobunaga's trust, told him that the Octobrist was trying to form an alliance with the Orde Empire and the nobles. However, her words made Nobunaga laugh because he felt very sure they would not be willing to form an alliance and risk their lives under the command of strangers like the drifters, who don't even belong to this world. Hearing this, Almanu did not deny that Nobunaga's words were true. Knowing that he seems to have the ability to formulate an effective strategy, she asks him for advice on the steps they should take to form an alliance to defeat the Black King. Nobunaga suggested that they take power from the nobles first, where the military aggression would be led directly by Toyohisa. The Octobrist or other parties, including the drifters, who wish to form an alliance with the three, must accept Toyohisa as their leader and be willing to follow all his orders. Almanu seemed very surprised to hear Nobunaga's words, and Toyohisa, who had been silent since then, listened to their conversation with great attention. He seemed annoyed that Nobunaga had arbitrarily appointed him as the leader, and they soon got into an argument. Seeing Toyohisa's undaunted attitude in dealing with any situation, Almanu thought it would not hurt them to try following Nobunaga's advice. Meanwhile, the Black King, who had controlled the fortifications of the northern region, was seen checking the condition of his soldiers who were injured in battle after receiving a report from one of the Ents, namely Grigory Rasputin. Surprisingly, the Black King has healing powers that can treat any disease and wound that seems impossible to heal. With this power, the Black King then healed all his wounded soldiers so that they could return to fight in the next battle. After that, the Black King ordered Rasputin to spread the victory of those who managed to occupy the fortress of the northern region and invite all races and nations that hate humans to join them and exterminate humanity from this world. In addition, the Black King also insists on the Ents to find the drifters as soon as possible and kill them before they unite their forces and form an alliance to fight against them. On the other hand, Naoshi seems to have difficulty flying his fighter plane because the plane was damaged in his battle against a herd of dragons. That's why Naoshi was forced to land his fighter plane in the middle of the wilderness. The noise caused by Naoshi when landing the plane attracted the attention of a group of mysterious creatures that inhabit the forest where he is currently. Instead of feeling afraid, he challenged the creatures to leave their hiding places and directly face them. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the elves were seen holding a meeting to discuss their next steps because sooner or later, the nobles would surely send troops to attack the village and slaughter them after they assassinated Aram. After a long discussion, the elves finally agreed to carry out a rebellion and form an alliance with the drifters who had helped them before. The scene then switches and shows Almanu, who then gives an amulet to Toyohisa and his comrades so that they can understand the language used by the inhabitants of that world. Nobunaga became even more curious about the figure of the leader of the Octobrist after seeing the amulet because it looked exactly like the amulet usually written by the Onmyoji from Kyoto. After that, Almanu told about the history of the elves being one of the demi-human race who were the original inhabitants of that world, where they lived in peace until 50 years ago they were defeated by the Orde Empire in a war. After that, the elves were forced to always submit and obey and were often treated arbitrarily. Hearing a piece of history about the elves, Nobunaga intends to attract their sympathy by offering revenge against the Orde Empire, who had colonized their place of residence and treated them as slaves for years. Nobunaga then asked Toyohisa to give a speech to increase the fighting spirit of the elves to rebel against the Orde Empire because, according to Nobunaga, Toyohisa has both strength and charisma as a good leader. Upon hearing that, Toyohisa then said that he would do his job, not against Nobunaga's wish, but because he couldn't allow the oppression of the weak to happen before his eyes. Full of confidence, Toyohisa began to give speeches in front of the elves, who seemed to show admiration for him, who supported and encouraged them to fight for a better and more decent life in the future so that they would no longer be victims of oppression from those who wanted to exploit the elves. Shara, the older brother of Marcia and Mark, reveals that he is the son of the village leader who was killed by Aram and asks Toyohisa and the drifters to help him. The other villagers must defeat the Orde Empire's troops, who are expected to invade their village in the next few days. However, Shara reveals that the elves do not have any skills in combat, while what they will face is the Orde Empire, which is notorious for being cruel and thirsty for power, where they do not hesitate to slaughter the demi-human races because they think humans are far superior to them in every way. Knowing this, Nobunaga thought that their chances of conquering the Orde Empire would be even greater because they would take advantage of the hatred of the elves and the other demi-human races and convince them to rebel against the oppression and cruelty they had endured during their lifetime. In the following days, the Orde Empire's army of 200 people was seen heading to the elf settlement to carry out a large-scale massacre of the elves who had killed Aram and his army. They apparently also knew about the elves who had formed an alliance with the drifters. However, the soldiers didn't seem too worried about it and felt confident they could complete the mission in no time. After traveling quite a distance from the capital, the soldiers of the Orde Empire finally arrived at the elves settlement. However, how shocked they were when they found out that the village had been abandoned by the elves. Although in reality, it is part of the war strategy that has been planned by Toyohisa and the drifters so that they can win the battle. The soldiers from the Orde Empire then rushed to find the whereabouts of the elves throughout the village, but the search effort failed because they found no sign of life in the village, as if the elves had indeed left the village where they had been living. Not only that, but they also found that the only well used as a source of clean water in the village had been polluted with dirt, so anyone who decided to stay in that place, even if only temporarily, would not get a clean water source. Meanwhile, up in the trees, Toyohisa and the elves were seen watching the movements of the Orde Empire soldiers below them, who planned to attack the troops at nightfall. The scene then switches to a few days earlier, where Toyohisa and the drifters are providing the elves with brief martial arts training and teaching them to use weapons such as swords, spears, and arrows, which they had previously gathered from the battle against Aram and his army. In addition, Nobunaga also ordered the elves to dispose of the bodies of Aram and his army in a large enough field, not to bury them. Although impressed as a cruel act, it is part of Nobunaga's war strategy because human bodies can produce certain substances that can be used as explosives if mixed with loose soil. Seeing how Nobunaga and Toyohisa devised a war strategy, Almanu immediately realized the big difference between civilians like herself and the drifters, who were tough fighters with different views on life and death. Nobunaga asked Almanu to inform the Octobrist about the war and asked them to send sulfur powder immediately. However, Nobunaga did not explain why he needed the sulfur powder. On the other hand, Yoichi is seen teaching the elves archery techniques and seems impressed that the elves can master archery techniques in a short time. One of the elves then tells Yoichi that the elves are actually natural-born archers. However, their archery skills are slowly fading because since being defeated by the Orde Empire, the elves are not allowed to wield any weapons at all. To motivate the elves, Yoichi then showed his archery skills, which immediately made them full of admiration because none of the arrows fired by Yoichi missed the target. After completing their training, Toyohisa gathered the elves, explaining the strategy they would use to win the battle against the Orde Empire's troops. Toyohisa also reminded the elves of the importance of fighting for their independence so they would no longer be treated as slaves. He informed that the battle against 200 soldiers of the Orde Empire was only the beginning of their military aggression because then they would carry out a more massive movement until peace was restored in the country. His words motivated the elves to take revenge for all the oppression and humiliation they had experienced so far and all the pent-up anger they would vent into the battle that would soon take place that night. Turning to the present, when the sun finally set and the day turned into night, Toyohisa led the elves to attack the Orde Empire soldiers camped in the village. With a fiery fighting spirit, he led the elves on the battlefield and knocked out one by one the soldiers who were on guard, then continued the attack by eliminating them from one tent to another. The screams of pain from the soldiers immediately broke the silence of the night. The soldiers of the Orde Empire finally realized that they were being attacked by the elves, who were supposed to be the targets of their massacre. Under the strategy they had planned, Toyohisa led the Imperial soldiers into the trap they had prepared. Meanwhile, Nobunaga and the elven army he led had prepared to carry out their duties as planned at the designated location. The moment reminded him of the past when he led an army of 200,000 people from the Oda clan. Even though currently only leading a group of inexperienced elves to fight on a battlefield that was ordinary to him, Nobunaga still had a fiery fighting spirit to defeat the enemy on the battlefield. He ordered the elves to shoot fire arrows toward their village, and immediately, the flames devoured the settlement. The fire was meant to surround the soldiers who were still there, where they were forced to come face to face with Nobunaga, who was waiting for them at the end of the exit. With a smirk on his face, Nobunaga greeted his enemies with joy. When the soldiers were within firing range, the elves immediately shot their arrows and slaughtered the enemy troops who tried to attack them. Judging from their fighting style, he knew that the troops sent by the Orde Empire were lower-level soldiers who were less experienced on the battlefield, so they could easily be defeated by them. After that, Nobunaga intended to target the commander of the army, because if the leader has been defeated, the troops will lose their fighting spirit and choose to surrender. He ordered the elves to shoot arrows that had been smeared with dirt, where they could leave scars infected by bacteria due to the absence of clean water to clean the wound. And if left like that, the soldiers would slowly die from the bacterial infection of the wounds. They were also increasingly cornered by Toyohisa, who arrived after slaughtering their comrades. However, as Nobunaga predicted earlier, Toyohisa finished the commander so that the war would end without having to put in more energy and time. With lightning speed, Toyohisa broke through the soldiers' barricades and swung his sword to kill the commander. Seeing their leader defeated, the soldiers panicked and lost their fighting spirit. On the other hand, Nobunaga seems satisfied with Toyohisa's success and is increasingly convinced that he can become a great leader on the battlefield because this leadership character has been passed down from generation to generation in the Toyohisa family. Meanwhile, the surviving soldiers tried to escape from the battlefield but were soon intercepted by Yoichi and a squad of archers, who slaughtered them. For some reason, the battle atmosphere reminded him more or less of someone from when he was alive. After successfully winning the battle, Toyohisa and his comrades will continue their march towards the nearest military base belonging to the nobles of the Orde Empire. Meanwhile, military officials looked worried at the headquarters because they had lost Aram and his army, who were tough soldiers. Moreover, the troops they sent to the elf settlements had not returned yet. They also became increasingly worried because they did not have enough soldiers to guard the place, and if suddenly an attack occurred, they would not be able to defend the base. One of the top military officers planned to send many troops to kill the elves carrying out the rebellion. This was done to prevent rebellions in other places that could threaten the empire's sovereignty. Not long after, a soldier came to meet the military officials in his room and informed them that the troops they sent to kill the elves had returned. Upon hearing that, the military officials were relieved and assumed that the rebellion had been overcome. In fact, the troops were Nobunaga and the elves in disguise. When they finally entered the base, Nobunaga and the elves broke their disguises and arrested everyone there. The military officials could only surrender when Nobunaga and his comrades occupied the base because they also did not have the strength to put up a fight. Toyohisa, who was already angry, then asked about the whereabouts of the elven women who had been held captive by them. After receiving information about where the elven women were held captive, Toyohisa and the elves rushed to that place. However, how heartbroken the elves were when they found out about their wives' and daughters' condition, which is also very worrying because they had only been used as slaves to satisfy the desires of depraved men. Knowing this, Toyohisa immediately became angry, determined to avenge the elven women against the savage men who had ruined their lives and would not stop until they all died painfully. On the other hand, Nobunaga and the other elves were seen searching the place, hoping to find important files that might be useful to make the next step easier. In that place, Nobunaga and Almanu found a fairly large portrait painting, which showed the face of a man who, according to Almanu, was the founder of the Orde Empire, Adolf Hitler. Furthermore, she told him that the Octobrists had not been able to confirm whether Hitler sided with the Drifters or vice versa because all this time, it was the nobles who ran the government who made the rules regarding the Drifters. After that, an elf told Nobunaga that Toyohisa was about to execute the top military officers as well as the soldiers of the Orde Empire who were in the base, who were responsible for the abuse they had committed against the elven women. Nobunaga rushed there to witness how Toyohisa carried out the execution. Before the execution, the military officials begged Toyohisa to forgive them. Toyohisa flatly refused their pleas because their oppression and depravity were unforgivable at all times, and the death penalty was the most appropriate reward for all of them. However, when he was about to execute them, Nobunaga suddenly hit his head from behind, causing him to collapse unconscious. Nobunaga actually did not intend to thwart the execution. He did it solely because he didn't want Toyohisa to get his hands dirty by killing the savage soldiers. He thinks that he is the one who is more suitable to execute these savage soldiers because Toyohisa is a leader. When he was about to fire a shot, suddenly, one of them raised his hand and tried to convince Nobunaga that he was not involved with all the barbaric acts carried out by the soldiers because he had just been transferred to the base. Hearing that, Nobunaga seemed slightly interested in the man, and it occurred to him to take advantage of the man for information that might facilitate their next move. Therefore, Nobunaga left the man alive while he immediately executed the others. Later, the news about the uprising of the elves, assisted by the drifters, finally spread to all corners of the country. The people also believed the news was true because the elven women held captive by the imperial soldiers had returned to their respective families. This moment was also used by Nobunaga to send a letter, inviting the elves in other areas to fight for their fate and be free from the oppression and abuse they have experienced so far. His plan turned out to be successful in moving the elves elsewhere to rebel and concentrate all their forces under the drifters' command. In a short time, rebellions broke out in many places and spread to all corners of the country. The nobles became increasingly panicked and anxious because their power was in danger of collapsing. In fact, many territories that were previously controlled by nobles and became part of the Orde Empire have now been completely taken over by their original owners, the elves. News of the uprising of the elves also reached Easy, who was suddenly irritated that the elves had formed an alliance with the drifters and built a fighting force against the Black King and the Ents. Meanwhile, defeat after defeat continued to be experienced by the Orde Empire troops, which frustrated the officials at the center of government because if they continued to swallow defeat, the Orde Empire's power would be completely destroyed soon. The war that has been going on for quite a while has drained all of its resources, strength, and strategy. However, they have not won until now. Realizing that they could not allow this situation to continue, one of the government officials then suggested that they make a peace agreement with the non-human races they had been fighting. However, other officials immediately rejected the proposal because they did not want to disappoint Adolf Hitler, who had gone to great lengths to establish the Orde Empire. While the officials had a heated argument, a noble named Count Saint Germy arrived there, and the officials fell silent for a moment because Saint Germy was one of the most influential people in the government. Not only that, a quarter of the Orde Empire's territory is in the hands of Saint Germy, so that man's words must always be listened to, and his orders must be obeyed. Saint Germy informs that the merchant guild Gubinen has attacked the imperial fleet sent to supply supplies to the west. The fleet was eventually destroyed before reaching its destination. Saint Germy then reveals that the Orde Empire will not last much longer because the wars they started have brought bad karma, especially now that their enemies had formed an alliance and concentrated their strength on counterattacking from various sides. In addition, the Orde Empire was also experiencing an internal crisis within its government. However, Saint Germy did not inform the officials of the solution to all these problems because he had his own plan to visit the elves and the drifters. They were the masterminds of the revolt that occurred throughout the country. Meanwhile, support from the elves for Toyohisa and his comrades continued to arrive from various regions, where they swore allegiance to fight on the side of Toyohisa and the drifters. However, this did not necessarily make Toyohisa feel happy because the larger the troops he led, the greater the chance of betrayal, making it difficult for the drifters in the future. He conferred with Nobunaga and Yoichi and tried to find ways to overcome their problems. Toyohisa suggested that they establish a leadership structure, but Nobunaga refused because he wanted to make Toyohisa the sole leader. Toyohisa then asserts that he doesn't care about power and just wants the great power they have amassed so far not to become a ticking time bomb for himself and the drifters. Knowing that he could not persuade Toyohisa if he had a strong will, Nobunaga finally agreed to his request. Even in his heart, he still intends to make Toyohisa the sole leader. After that, the elves who had just joined took training from Toyohisa and the drifters to develop their respective abilities and talents. Nobunaga asked Shara to find a talented blacksmith who could make many replica firearms. Shara tells Nobunaga that the dwarves are the most reliable blacksmiths in the world, and only they can make such replicas. Elsewhere, Yoichi is seen teaching the young elves archery techniques. Yoichi seems serious about training them because he wants the young elves to become reliable soldiers in the upcoming battles. Likewise, Toyohisa teaches inexperienced elves how to fight using a sword. However, the elves didn't seem very good at using the sword in close combat, as they were more skilled at archery. In the evening, Toyohisa and the drifters sense a threat approaching them. At the same time, two of the Ents, John Dark and Jules de Rise, and a Black King's army cavalry were heading to their hideout. The first part of the Drifters anime series is finally finished. What is the story of the struggle of Toyohisa and his comrades? Will they be able to overthrow the ruthless Orde Empire? Look forward to the continuation of the story in the next video. Thank you for watching.